So I'm going to be talking about the difference between fiction and nonfiction as applied to religious narratives. And here is a familiar question, which the people in this room get asked more often than I do. Is the Bible fiction? And of course, there are the religious texts you can ask this about, but I'm going to focus on the Bible just as the example. Right? Now, it's typically assumed that when you say the Bible is fiction, what you mean is the Bible is false. Because there's an assumption that being fiction means it's made up, it's false, the events related in the stories did not occur. Okay, so that's kind of the bog standard assumption behind this question. And also, along with that, that some characters in the Bible, or I use that term neutrally, don't exist, right? So questions arise. Was Moses fictional? Was Esther fictional? Is God a fictional character? Okay, so those are the kinds of questions. And if you say the Bible is nonfiction, it's often taken to mean that it's somehow factually or historically true. Okay. And I just want to point out, because I'm going to set this aside, but I'm happy to discuss it later, that the question of whether or not the language in the Bible or any other religious text is to be taken literally or figuratively is actually an orthogonal question, because figurative language occurs in nonfiction and non-figurative literal language occurs in fiction. And so it's actually not the same question, even though there are implications for the larger question, depending on what you say about this. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, some other accounts, very briefly. I'm going to give my account, the genre theory of fiction, and I'm going to see how it might apply to some texts in the Bible. Okay, so fiction versus nonfiction. We do use the term fiction to mean false, right? So his testimony was a fiction, just means it was false. But when the question, and this is the question I'm concerned with, is how to classify works, right? I think this applies to representational works generally, but most often and paradigmatically to narrative works. This way of distinguishing between fiction and nonfiction is not plausible. Nonfictions contain many falsehoods, right? That could be due to ignorance. Someone tells you something is not true because they don't know. It could be due to deceit, right? Lies are not fiction in the sense of a work. It could also be due to purposeful invention. There are many genres of nonfiction that allow for various forms of invention, as I'll describe in a minute. Now, philosophers of the analytic stripe, in any case, typically reject semantic definitions of fiction. That is, definitions in terms of whether it's true or false, whether it refers to real things or doesn't refer to real things. And they also reject syntactic conceptions, which are most notably associated with the narratologist Kette Hamburger, which rely on linguistic or textual devices, for example, free indirect discourse. So this is a sentence in Middlemarch. Dorothea was in the best temper now. That's an example of free indirect discourse. You have the time adverb not matching the tense of the verb, right? It's because you're getting inside someone's head in a sort of ambiguous relationship to the narrator. Okay? And it's a form that often looks fictional to people. Okay, but of course, it does also occur in nonfiction. So these are things that might be characteristic of fiction, but they're not essential. That is, the fact that a work of nonfiction has free indirect discourse or talks about something that doesn't exist doesn't make it fiction. That's the idea. Now, philosophers generally take the distinction to be, in some sense, pragmatic. So Margaret MacDonald proposed that we were engaged in that fiction writers were engaged in pretense. John Searle called these pretended speech acts. The most common view these days is a view that Greg Curry, but also David Davies and Kathleen Stock have defended, that fictions are made up at least partly by a certain kind of speech act, which is an invitation to imagine, rather than being made up of assertions, which involve invitations to believe and thereby characterize nonfiction. There are some related views. I'm just giving these citations to the fictive utterance view. And this is just a note that these ideas that fictions involve a speech act that invites imagining is an idea that's inspired by Kendall Walton, but it's not actually his own view. Okay, now I have written quite a lot and spoken quite a lot critiquing these kinds of approaches, and I can't do justice to the ins and outs of that debate here. So I'll just tell you my basic objection, which is designed to help motivate my own account. Right? It's very simple. There are works of fiction that invite belief, and they do so sometimes by making assertions, in my view. A work like War and Peace is a very clear example. But similarly, Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun tells you a great deal about the Nigerian Civil War. And at the same time, there are works of nonfiction that invite imagining, and not simply imagining, but imagining what was made up. Now, in Cold Blood, although there is some controversy about what Capote claimed, he claimed all of it was true, but it was in a literary form. He invites you to imagine experiencing the events, imagine what it was like, and so on and so forth. Tacitus, like other classical Greek and Roman historians, made up speeches and battle descriptions according to conventional rules of the time. And that doesn't mean that Tacitus is no longer a historian. That was conventional for history then. So the upshot of this, right, is that, of course, I've gone very fast through this. My view is that there are no essential criteria for distinguishing fiction from nonfiction. There's no definition via some single dimension. Is it more true? Is it more made up? Is it more imaginative? Where you could say that the difference between fiction and nonfiction is simply a matter of degree along some single line. So I reject that kind of account. So on my account, fiction and nonfiction are genres, which in a certain sense is so obvious as not to be needed to be said when you think of genres as simply being categories. But by this I mean something stronger. They're genres in the same sense that romance novel is a genre, right? Or biography is a genre. I take genres to be defined by two fundamental elements. So in the first place, works will be classified by a variety of non-essential features, including what I call internal and categorical features, and I will explain that in just a moment in more detail. And in addition, for something to be a genre, the classification has to be relevant to the appreciation of the work. So it has to be relevant in the sense that to understand the work or to evaluate the work, knowing what the genre is will have an effect on those processes. So relying on some work in literary theory, one might think of fiction and nonfiction as supergenres relative to other subgenres. I don't care which is super and which is sub. Genres nest along a lot of dimensions. And for those of you who are familiar with it, this is borrowing from Walton's paper, Categories of Art from 1970. And this is how he thinks of categories of art. But fiction and nonfiction aren't necessarily art, so I set aside that aspect of it. Okay, so that's the basic theory. Let me explain it in slightly more detail. The first element, classification by what I've called internal features. What are internal features? Internal features are features that you can, in some sense, find in the work itself. Okay. As you'll see, they have some external connections. This is purely a way of saying features that you can ascribe to the work that don't have to do with its historical context. That's going to be the key difference. Okay, so again, using the categories of art discussion, when you classify, you're classifying typically by whether the work has, one aspect of this is whether it has standard features. So genres have standard features, that is, features that you expect them to have if they're in the genre. And so you classify by, say, these standard features. For example, broadly speaking, fictions typically have narrative structure. They typically have elements that are made up. They typically invite you to imagine their content. They typically include non-referential terms. They use certain kinds of linguistic devices like free and direct discourse or once upon a time, right? They typically have a paratext that says things like, this is a novel, right? That's also a useful feature. Okay, so that's fiction. And nonfiction, as a whole, tends to have a variable structure. So there are arguments that are nonfiction, expository nonfiction, descriptive nonfiction. typically has terms that refer to real things. It typically asks you to believe something. It typically comes with expectations and suppositions of accuracy that guide your assumptions in reading. And of course, some subgenres or works might have contra-standard features. So for example, I don't have a picture of this. When you talk about narrative structure, for example, Nabokov's Pale Fire does not have a narrative structure. It has the structure of a poem followed by a long critique. That's the structure. It's an unusual structure. It's still fiction. It has a lot of the other standard features and so on. But if you think about, this is just a couple novels to think about, Things Fall Apart or Mrs. Dalloway, they meet many of these criteria. They are pretty standard for fiction, despite being unusual fictions in other ways. They meet kind of your expectations for works of fiction in these ways. Now, that is a question of what I'm calling internal features. And internal features have tended to be the kinds of features that people have talked about as defining fiction and nonfiction. And that is part of what I think is a mistake, because thinking about fiction and nonfiction requires you to think about the context in which the work is embedded. So this is what I call categorical features. So there are features that make reference to the category, as it were, explicitly. Okay? So these are contextual features, as I say, concerning classification itself. And the ones I have focused on are things like authorial intentions regarding categorization and contemporary practices of classification. Okay. So let me just give an example. I can't go backwards. Okay, let me give an example of how authorial intentions can matter. This is not a fiction, nonfiction case, although there are really interesting cases, but people might be familiar with the debate over the turn of the screw. So Henry James Rose, it's a ghost story, but a famous Freudian critic suggested in the 20th century that it should be read actually as the rantings of a delusional mind, so somebody who thinks they've seen ghosts but haven't really. Right? And they had arguments for this perspective. However, James's intention is very clear. He was explicit. This is definitely supposed to be a ghost story. Right? Henry James wrote 4 ghost stories, and this is one of the ghost stories that he wrote. And so if you take seriously this proposal, right, the authorial intentions, as well as the contemporary practices, it was treated as a ghost story until the critic came up with this idea in the next century. Then you'll regard this, even though it could be read in more than one way, you will regard it as a ghost story. And as I say, given the evolution of practices, there might be works that are both fiction and nonfiction, neither fiction or nonfiction, or it simply is impossible to say. So one of my side views or implications of my views is that Shakespeare's histories, this isn't a picture of Shakespeare's histories, obviously, but it's just to remind me to talk about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's histories are both fiction and nonfiction. At the time, they were classified as what is called historical poesy, which has elements of both fiction and nonfiction. And I think that it can be read in either way. The histories can be read in either way, and it's very fruitful to read them in each of the different ways. You can try it. I'm setting aside the question of performance here because it could be performed with different assumptions. Okay? And there are questions that can arise with classification about reception. What about our practices? Right? I think that's an important question. I've tended to focus on the historical context, but we can discuss how much the view would change if we focused on reception. The important point is that there will be contextual features that help you to classify whether something is fiction or nonfiction. Okay, so of course, as I said before, there's 2 dimensions to the theory, right? And fiction and nonfiction, on my view, are what are called appreciative kinds. That means that they make a difference to how you appreciate them. So there's a category of heavy paintings, right? You could stipulate that paintings that weigh over a certain amount are all in this category, the category of heavy paintings. But I take it that this will not, I'm sure there's an artist who would disagree, but let's assume that in the normal case, the fact that a painting is heavy plays no role in how you appreciate the painting, right? So for fiction and nonfiction to be genres in my sense, it's not enough to show that here's how they're classified. I also have to be able to say that it makes a difference whether they're classified one way or the other. And I rely, when I talk about this, on various empirical studies. So knowledge of the category influences how we understand work. So there's evidence of what I'll describe as online inferential processes being different. That is, how we read and how we process the text from moment to moment, and then how we remember what we have read is different if we think it's fiction or nonfiction. And it's also relevant to evaluation, right? So other things being equal, which they often are not, invention is more likely to be problematic in nonfiction. Right? So you're just not going to criticize a fiction for having characters who don't exist, right? That just isn't something that normally will come up. Okay. So let me say something about the implications of this view for epistemology, because that is a large part of the reason people are interested in the question in the first place of whether or not the Bible is fiction or nonfiction. Okay, so according to the genre theory, there are no essential epistemic differences between fiction and nonfiction. Why? Because there aren't any essential differences between fiction and nonfiction, so it follows that that will be true of the epistemology. So in my view, all the ways we can learn from nonfiction are also ways we can learn from fiction. Okay? So there will be fictions that include things like testimony. Right? And I think that Oliver Twist is a good example of a case where you can learn. In fact, there are passages which simply describe, for example, baby farms or the orphan system and so on, which can be treated as assertions about what was going on at the time in Victorian England and were intended to be treated that way, and you can learn from them. So although I don't think there's an essential difference, I do think that certain forms of learning may be facilitated by standard features, right? So the fact that fictions have certain kinds of features typically might make them more conducive to learning in certain ways. That's the idea. And also, of course, people's knowledge of the category will influence how they remember or learn from a text, right? Although you might think that this suggests that if they think they're reading fiction, they're more likely to be skeptical, that turns out to be a much more nuanced question. So people often believe a variety of things in fiction, and there's some evidence that for some kinds of things, they are more likely to believe it in fiction than in nonfiction. Okay, so it's a complicated story. But I want to focus in particular on narrative structure, because narrative structure is a standard feature of fiction, right, and not a standard feature of nonfiction. And even when you have a nonfiction narrative, like a story or a biography, they typically, again, all of this is just what's typical, they typically include more exposition or argument than fictional narratives. There's far more pausing to give you background. Even Thackeray doesn't resemble your average historian in the level of commentary and explanation that occurs, breaking up the narrative. And you don't get, for example, so many quotes, dialogue, and so on. You can get that in the genre of interview, right, in a nonfiction. But in your average history or biography, you don't get a lot of dialogue, which keeps the narrative going. So the question then is, what kind of learning does narrative foster, right? Because I think a lot of the cognitive values often attributed to fiction are really values of narrative. Okay, so if you can get a nonfiction narrative that is more narrative than exposition, then you should have some of the same kinds of learning. So a lot of the discussion of how we learn, say, ordinary facts from fiction would be from testimony. So the model is, right, nonfiction involves testimony. So now let's see if we can get something similar going on in fiction that might help us learn historical facts, for example, right? Is there testimony? And it is my view that there is testimony in fiction. But I don't think that that's the right way to think about how we learn from a narrative. We don't learn from a narrative simply by being told facts, okay, which is how testimony is typically treated. What we do instead is we comprehend narratives by constructing mental models or situation models. So these are terms from the psychology of narrative comprehension and other, in fact, of understanding and comprehension generally. Mental models, the terms from Johnson-Laird, and situation models from Van Dyke and Kinch. And I think of this as what's happening when we're imagining a world. We're forming a complex mental representation of the individuals, the events, how they unfold. And so we don't comprehend narratives by getting, here's a list of the things that have happened. We construct a mental representation of the events that has analog features, modal features, and so on. And typically simultaneously, right, this is the part about learning, we selectively export certain representations from these situation models into our mental representations of the world. So we can distinguish these as if there are two stages of learning. Right? First, comprehend the text, form a mental representation of what's gone on, then choose parts that you think are true, accurate representations of the world, and export them to your beliefs. In practice, it doesn't happen in two stages like that at all. You are selectively exporting and selectively importing information from the world into your mental representation and going the other way as you read. And the result of this process, which I have described very briefly, there's a lot more to say, is not piecemeal propositional knowledge, but what is called objectual understanding. So I here contrast this with the kind of understanding that Greg was talking about yesterday. So it's not understanding why, right? It's not explanatory understanding, although it is related. It's understanding a phenomenon. So understanding the Korean War, right? Understanding the strife in Northern Ireland. Okay? So understanding something, understanding chemistry. Okay? And this kind of understanding includes things like making connections. So suppose you have a set of truths. A list of truths is not very useful, but if you know how they connect, if you've weighted them, like this one's significant, but this one is peripheral, and also related to a capacity to apply what you've learned to new situations. Right? So you don't really understand it if you don't see how it applies beyond what you are doing now. And according to some, like most notably Catherine Elgin, but she's not the only one, understanding is non-factive. That is, you can understand something even if the content of your understanding includes that which is not true. Okay. And the kind of example, the reasons that are given, right, understanding comes in degrees. So Elgin gives the following kind of example. Copernicus believed that the planets, other celestial bodies, went round the sun in circles. And that is false. They don't go around the sun in circles. I'm sure you know. However, Copernicus's understanding was better than Ptolemy's. Right? Ptolemy didn't have the sun at the center. So that's a beginning problem. So even though Copernicus had a kind of centrally false belief that affects the way that he represents how the solar system works, he had better understanding. So understanding comes in degrees. That's the idea. And according to Elgin, sometimes understanding is improved by felicitous falsehoods. Falsehoods that help you organize the material in a simpler way, which would be obscured by knowing the truth. And the standard example of that is something like the ideal gas law. The ideal gas law only works if you assume that the molecules don't interact with each other, which is false of any real gas. But to explain what's actually going on would not help you understand what the ideal gas law is trying to give you. Okay. Now I defend, depending on how you interpret Elgin, a stronger relation to accuracy and truth in understanding than she does, but I agree with her that understanding can be fostered by that which is false. Okay, so that I think is right. Okay. Now, what about narratives and how do they foster understanding? Well, most of the research on this in psychology has been comparing narrative to expository texts. And by comparison with expository texts, the narrative structure improves understanding. That is, people do better on comprehension tests later when they read about the same thing, but in a narrative form. Why is that? Probably because we've been exposed to narratives since we were kids. How can you explain that historically? Narratives have been going all the way back. I have no idea if that's because there's something in the structure of the brain that makes it easier to process narratives, and that's how we started, or just social familiarity. It just happened that we started out with narratives. I don't know. Nonetheless, it turns out to be true that people process information more easily in a narrative form. Other things that aid understanding include imagistic language, personal and emotional engagement, and interest. Right? So if you tell somebody, read this for entertainment, and you give them the same thing and say, read it for study, they'll grasp everything better when they're told to read it for entertainment. Right? And if it's interesting, they will also grasp more. These are not very surprising results, but they are results. So narrative structure will aid in understanding in these ways. And in addition, falsification of a certain kind can aid. When there are simplifications or abstractions, right, that can, as in the ideal gas law, aid understanding in a certain way. So One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is, I think, a classic example of this. Right? Solzhenitsyn takes the experiences of himself and other people who were in the Gulag and creates a composite character who experiences a number of those individual kinds of experiences through the course of a single day. That's the idea. And if you've read Solzhenitsyn, you'll be struck by how much shorter A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is compared to his other writings, for example, Gulag Archipelago. But if you want to know what it was like to experience the Gulag, if you want to understand how it was to be there, you really can't do much better than this book. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that simplification can go too far, right? Another thing that aids in understanding is having to make some effort of your own. So you'll remember better the inferences you draw yourself, okay, than the ones that are told to you, right? And so this has to do with things like age and sophistication. For someone young, there's more explicit, more simple, helps them learn. As you get older and more sophisticated, it turns out that leaving things out, as sophisticated narratives tend to do, and asking you to make the effort to understand what's going on is a superior way of understanding. In fact, there are some studies that showed that simply taking letters out of words made people understand the text better because they had to put in a little bit more effort to figure out what they were reading. Okay? And I think it's worth noting that there are possibly other forms of learning. I'm not talking about those, but which I think are relevant to religious texts, of course. Particularly virtue education. So this is a whole movement, educating for the virtues, educating for moral character, educating for intellectual virtues like open-mindedness. That's a topic that I'm working on at the minute. And the standard mechanism of virtue education is exemplar, right? So the life of someone virtuous, or perhaps the life of someone vicious who comes to a bitter end, right, is part of how it's generally thought we can learn the virtues. Okay? And so, of course, that is going to be something that appears in a narrative where you get the story of a virtuous life as opposed to a set of injunctions that tells you what to do to be virtuous. Okay, so finally back to the actual topic, classifying religious texts. So I'm going to focus on the Bible, as I said. And I want to really open this, I'm going to talk about this as a set of challenges. I'm going to say how my theory might apply and talk about a case study. But really, this is designed to open discussion because I don't have answers to these questions, but I think that they're the right questions to raise. So among the challenges we face in thinking about how to classify religious texts, how to classify the Bible, is one that came up in discussion yesterday. What is the work? Right? Is the work the Bible? And if the work is the Bible, which one? Right? Is it one testament, and then the other testament, right, is how do you divide up the work? Is it even possible to classify any version of the Bible as a whole? And this is an important question for me because I think the classification of a work as a whole is what affects your appreciation, right? So you see free and direct discourse in fiction, and it's just normal. You see it in nonfiction, and you think, ooh, interesting, right? So those are differences that occur at the level of whole work classification. So it's very important on my theory that we think about what the work is. Or is it a collection of works, right? Which, for various reasons, seems more plausible at the start, that there's a collection of works that we call the Bible. But if it's a collection, how do we individuate the works that make up the collection? Is it by author? Right? And that's tricky because it might have to be by, say, a couple of authors. It doesn't seem like it's enough to just say an author when you know going in that there are parts, say, individual stories in the Bible, like ones that David talked about yesterday, that were actually, we believe, written by more than one person at different times, right? People edited it later and changed things. Okay. Do we individuate by subject matter, right? So the story of creation, regardless of how many people might have contributed to it. Do we differentiate by structure, the narrative parts versus the prescriptive parts, or purpose, right? Tell you what to do, tell you what not to do. By time period, right? Even the Old Testament's written at different times. Okay, so you get the idea. It's very complicated to summarize, right? And a question that doesn't usually come up when people talk about authorship with respect to the Bible, so almost all of the discussion concerns the people who wrote down what we have, because you can see the stylistic differences and so on. But I just note that that's not how we treat other works that come down to us that originated in oral traditions, right? We call the author of the Odyssey and the Iliad Homer. But Homer isn't the one who wrote it down. In fact, as far as I can tell, there's almost no discussion of who actually wrote it down. He's the potentially mythical originator of the oral tradition. But I'm just pointing that out as something we can't know, but in principle, they might be the relevant parties, as it were, to thinking about how to classify the work. Now, with respect to the genre theory, I'm going to talk about the challenges that arise in trying to apply the theory to the Bible, right? So the first thing is the standard features vary widely, right? The features, even within individual books, you have a lot of different styles, right? You have different forms, you have narrative, you have laws or rules, you have poetry and songs, you have proverbs, you have letters, people divide it up differently. These are some of the standard ones that get discussed. I actually read something, I have no idea if this is true, that said, taken as a whole, the Bible is something like 50% narrative and 30% laws and rules. I don't know who came up with this distinction, but in any case, clearly all of these things occur. There are different styles, which are typically motivate the view that there are different authors, so the styles tend to be relevant to how we think about authorship by kind of working backwards, right? Point out that in reality, actual authors can write in different styles, so it's not entirely definitive. Right? There are a variety of interestingly different grammatical constructions, different kinds of use of personal pronouns, different parts of the Bible, and of course different allusions to current events or places and so on, which are used to help date sections of the Bible. And I point out as well that the fact that the works have a religious subject matter, right, or purpose, right, if there's anything that's a kind of, as it were, standard feature that does pick out the Bible as a whole, it is the religious subject matter and purpose. Of course, with respect to thinking about fiction and nonfiction, that isn't going to be enough. There's enormous amount of what is known as biblical fiction, which is not the Bible, but fictions that are related to stories in the Bible, right? Okay, but when you have a situation like, for example, Shakespeare's history plays, where the standard features are mixed, let's say, and don't help all that much with your classification, you look to the categorical features. Was it intended to be a history or a historical fiction, right? That kind of thing. And there are difficulties with categorical features as well, right? Of course, we don't know who the authors were in many cases, right? The more recent, there's more discussion of. They're traditional authors, but historiographers will tell you that they aren't always the real authors. And even if you knew who all the authors were, right, they haven't told us what their intentions were. We can assume their intentions were to contribute to the religious life of the community, but that doesn't so much help with the fiction-nonfiction distinction. Right? And it's also not obvious how we pin down the relevant contemporary categorization practices. Right? We don't know how it was received. Right? We look for evidence of that. We don't actually know for sure in many cases, and that changes over time. So the fact that a later community treated a work in one way doesn't mean that the original community treated it in the same way. So there are all of these kinds of challenges. Now, I want to say that it's not hopeless. There are things that we can do. In fact, much of the discussion, I think, has highlighted some of these. Right? There is research into historical context, not into authorial attention, where nobody expects to find that out, but certainly the context and how works were treated. Right? The essential preliminary tends to be the dating of different parts of the text so that you know what context to look at. And of course, that's controversial in itself in many cases. There's efforts to find physical evidence through archaeological excavations. I don't mean physical evidence of the events related in the Bible. I mean physical evidence of how parts of the Bible were treated by the relevant communities. So quite a bit, we're getting more illumination because of Qumran, and that was a huge discovery, and one I'm sure there are archaeologists out there hoping to make more to find out whether we can say more about how these works were treated. And there's other kinds of evidence of how some texts were treated by their communities. For example, there's ample evidence from the rabbinical tradition that these texts weren't taken literally. Right? So we have some evidence of that in one case. And there are also comparative approaches that examine, once you've got some dating, the contemporary literary, historical, and sacred practices in other cultures on the assumption that there was interaction and imitation and so on. Right? So there's a really interesting paper comparing personal pronouns in Acts to the way personal pronouns are used in Thucydides, Polybius, and Josephus, which I just found fascinating because I'm interested in pronouns on the side, for fun. But in any case, this is the kind of thing where you might think, oh, well, if various people in sort of the contemporary world were using the pronouns for this purpose, then perhaps we can say something about how they were used in parts of the Bible. Okay, so I want to give, just do a quick kind of example of thinking all of this with the book of Esther, which I've gone through the challenges, so this isn't as challenging as some of the other kinds of cases, right? Because, as I've discovered, and everybody here, except perhaps some fellow philosophers, can correct what I'm saying here, because I'm getting this from the Hebraist Adele Berlin. So I'm taking her word for some of this. Okay, so the book of Esther is more likely to be considered fiction by scholars than many other books of the Bible, and has been considered fiction for longer. So the idea that other parts of the Bible are fiction is a more recent kind of critical discussion. This has been around for since early 20th century. And in saying that it's fiction, what's meant is not merely that it's not history, but also that it's not myth or legend, which is an interesting contrast. So myths might be part of a tradition. A fiction is something that humans made up for some purpose. A myth is something that originated behind you in the sands of time, right? So they're treating these as different. Okay. And the internal features of the book of Esther are mixed, and Berlin gives a very nice overview of this. So she says this: Esther certainly has an engaging plot and characters and intricate ironies and ambiguities. So I could easily align it with Euripides rather than with Herodotus. On the other hand, Esther has a stronger authorial self-consciousness than most other biblical narratives, although perhaps not as strong as Herodotus. There is less direct discourse, and hence the narrator's presence is strongly felt. The narrator stands at some distance from his story and often inserts explanations for why things happen. There is also concern with sources, or at least with recording things in official documents. So I might then conclude that Esther is historiography, by which Berlin means what we usually mean by history. In fact, a number of scholars do so for just these reasons. So Esther is a story, it's entertaining, it's funny, and so on. But on the other hand, it's lacking some features that you would normally associate with fiction. So I think it's just a nice description of the complexity of looking at just the manifest features of the text. So what can we find out from the categorical features, right? There's a debate about how the ancient reader would have understood the book of Esther. So just as with the rest of the Bible, but there's an ongoing debate about this. So there seems to be a consensus. This is probably everything I'm about to say is very controversial, but there seems to be a consensus that it was written relatively late relative to the rest of the Old Testament, in the Persian period, the Hellenistic period. And some have argued that it's fiction partly because they think it's written at a time when fictional storytelling forms were being developed. This scholar Wills has an entire book about the development of the Jewish novel he thinks it's Hellenistic, during that period. It's well known that Ahasuerus is identified with the Persian king Xerxes. The name is actually just a variation on the same name, so that isn't a complicated identification. Information about Persia at the time is accurate, about the court, about the postal system, all those kinds of details are accurate. But it's not clear that it was intended to be conveying that information because a lot of it is consistent with widespread stereotypes and conventions of representing the Persians at the time. And Berlin's own view, which I don't find entirely convincing, is that Esther is a kind of comic fiction that imitates other biblical narratives in order to do a kind of send-up of them. And she says this: historiography is not a comic genre, and Esther is very comic, which is, of course, relying on a certain kind of internal feature, which I think we can question. It may be the histories of the time were not comic, that's possible, but certainly not generally true that histories can't be comic. Ooh, well, that went by fast. Okay, I hope you can still see. Classifying religious texts like the Bible or its books as fiction or nonfiction, right? What I've argued is that that relies on a lot of features. Many of them conflict. Many of them cannot be ascertained. It's very complicated, right? But there's a further question to ask on my account. Why does it matter? Why does it matter whether we classify the Bible or parts of the Bible as fiction or nonfiction, especially if fiction doesn't just mean false, right? Because I have said classification plays a role in understanding and in appreciating literary works in general, right? But there is a further dimension to appreciation in the case of texts that are sacred or devotional, or in particular, still sacred and devotional, right, for certain people. Right? What's the role of this classification in religious practice? What difference would it make, right, to the practice to construe parts of the Bible as fiction or nonfiction? And I'm going to leave that as a question for further discussion among people who will know how to answer it better than I. And I'll thank you.